as athletes and coaches, we're often faced with this conflict of we either do too much training, so we lose speed and power and we're really fatigued, or else we do too little training and we don't get any physiological or muscular level adaptation. This study and the video we're doing today should hopefully show you the perfect sets and reps for a training program. So this week on the paper review, we're looking at a study done in Spain by Fernando Pereblenco et al. This is a fairly recent study. I think it was done in 2019. The title is Time Course of Recovery from Resistance Exercise with Different Set Combinations or Different Set Configurations. So what does this mean? Basically, it's a study looking at recovery outcomes, so both mechanical recovery outcomes and biochemical recovery outcomes following different reps and sets done in resistance training. So it was done with bench press and back squat. Why is it important to look at this? So in terms of program design, when you're looking to get actual adaptation, and then when you're looking for maintenance of kind of speed outcomes and maintenance of homeostasis with hormone outcomes following training. So basically for coaches like us, if we're looking to keep someone fast during a training cycle, or else if we're really looking to seek adaptations during a training cycle, these kind of studies are very important. The last thing then is who'd be interested in this. So if you're an athlete involved in a power sport, so it might be a field sport, it might be kind of classical track and field where your power outcomes are super important, this study is really applicable to you. As well, if you're a coach and you're involved in program design, so if you're somebody who's really looking for hypertrophy or you're really looking for speed and power increases, this study is really applicable to you.
Okay, so Fitz just did the introduction of what the study is about. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the methods and procedures that they went through of the whole study. So what we had was 10 men. They were between the ages of 22 plus or minus 3.5 years. They had some resistance training, but they were essentially, what they said in the study was not strength trained. So we can take that out. They'd done a little bit of gym work, a little bit of sports, but maybe not a whole lot of strength training. And evidenced by the numbers, their 1RMs, they had no strength training. So anyway, moving on. So we did 20 weeks study. There was 10 protocols, so I'm just going to need to read these out to you. So what they did was the participants did workouts where they did 3 sets at varying protocols, okay? So at different percentages of their absolute load for example, a 12RM or a 10RM. So they went through, so bear with me, so they did 12 reps at their 12RM, they did 3 sets. And they had 5 minutes rest between these 3 sets. Then the next workout was 6 reps at their 12RM. Then they did 10 reps at their 10RM. 3 sets at all of these now again, okay? So then they did 5 reps. Hang on, no, I need to start this again. Needs to be a better way of describing it. Okay. So you just saw there Fitz did the introduction to the study, and I'm just going to talk through a little bit of the methods and procedures, okay? So we had 10 men. They were ages 22.1 plus or minus 3.5 years. They had some resistance training experience, but as the study said, that they were not strength trained. So essentially they were young males who'd done some sport, some gym work, but not really a lot of dedicated strength training, okay? And this is kind of evidenced by their 1RMs, okay? So we had a 20-week study. We had 10 protocols that they used. They used these protocols randomly. So each of these protocols are assigned randomly throughout the study. Each workout was done every 14 days over the 20 weeks. So it was not done in order, but I'm going to give you the order from highest to lowest kind of reps. So they got their persistence 1RM on week 1 before the trial started. They had 4 familiarization workouts over the course of 2 weeks to get used to. What they used was a Smith machine for back squat and bench, okay? So the squat was below parallel. The bench had 1.5 second pause in the chest to eliminate any stretch reflex and to kind of keep things consistent, okay? So the workouts they did, I'll give you them in order from highest reps. So they did 3 sets at all of these percentages, okay? And they had 5 minutes rest in between each of these percentages. So they did their 12RM and they did 3 sets of 12. Then they did essentially 50% of this. So they did 6 reps for 3 sets at still again at the 12 RM. Then they had 10 reps at their 10 RM, and then they had 5 reps at their 10 RM. So again, 3 sets of all of these. So everything's 3 sets. So next protocol was 8 reps at 8 RM, 3 sets of that, 5 minutes rest. 4 reps at their 8 RM, 3 sets again. Same with their 6 RM. So they did 6 reps and 3 reps. So again, 3 sets at each of these, 5 minutes rest. And then finally, they had 4 reps at their 4 RM, and then they did 2 reps at their 4 RM. Again, 3 sets at each of these, 5 minutes rest. Okay. So the percentage they kind of gave their 12 RM was approximately 70%. Their 10 RM was approximately 75%. Their 8 RM was approximately 80%. 6 RM was approximately 85%. And then their 4 RM was approximately 90%. Okay, so they used, like we said, back squat and bench and a Smith machine. They did the back squat and the squat every 14 days on the same day. In between the squat and the bench, they had 10 minutes rest, okay? So as you said, 14 days apart, random order of these. So they just random order of these protocols. So it wasn't from the highest to the lowest. So just randomly each one of them. 1 RM was determined at the start. So what they used, interestingly, in this study was a velocity-based observation on the speed that their squats and bench were moving at to keep it at what they would have deemed the appropriate load for their percentage of their RM. Okay, so what they're saying is that their force and velocity are related, so their absolute load would have moved at a particular velocity. So they knew that they were saying that their 12 RM, for example, would move at a particular speed, and so they monitored the participants' speed of their barbell moving at this particular speed to keep it at the appropriate, what they deemed percentage of their rep max. Okay, so measurements were taken pre-exercise of their counter movement jump, and then they picked a load that moved at 1 meters per second. Okay, and so this load is useful because they use this again post exercise, 6 hours post, 24 hours post, and 48 hours post. So during these time points, they measured their counter movement jump height, and then again they took this load that moved at 1 meters per second pre-trial, and then they measured the speed at which this load moved at these time points. So post exercise, 6 hours post, 24 hours post, and 48 hours post. So their counter movement jump height and absolute load again were measured pre-study. Now, in addition to this, we had our biomechanical or mechanical exercises, and then we measured our biochemical. So our testosterone was measured, their cortisol was measured, growth hormone, prolactin, IGF-1, and creatine kinase. So these were measured obviously pre-study, and then they were measured again post-study and 48 hours post-study, okay? Or post-exercises, each one of these protocols. So the participants did no other training. They did no strenuous activity 4 days pre-exercise. It was done at the same time every day. So whenever these protocols were done, whatever time the participants did them, all throughout the 20 weeks, they did them at the exact same time every day. They had a standardized warm-up, which we'll get to later. And again, so we mentioned the Smith machine. And then finally, after what was measured after the trial was done after each protocol was completed, they measured again. So as we said, their testosterone, cortisol, growth hormone, prolactin, IGF-1, and creatine kinase. And then the mechanical fatigue was measured using a decline in velocity across their 3 sets. So from the fastest rep to the slowest rep across the 3 sets, they got a percentage lost between these, and they use this as a way of monitoring their velocity. They measured the change in velocity from the load that we got initially, that moved at 1 meter per second. We got this load, and they measured how slow this moves or how fast it moves after each one of these protocols at these different time points. And then lastly, we measured their counter movement height, or counter movement jump height. So that's a managed procedure, a little bit to them. Hopefully you got the gist of those. If you really want to get into it, you can kind of look at their at the study if you want, but that'll give you a good idea. So quite intricate, a lot of work done by the participants. Perfect.
Okay, so as we said, there's kind of 2 streams to this, right? There's our mechanical effects of the intervention or of the test, and then there's the biochemical effects of the test. What we'll do first is just go through the biochemical effects and kind of break them down for each one. So cortisol is a stress hormone. We typically see this in times of heightened anxiety or heightened stress. We'd see it in times of overtraining and even in times of overreaching in athletes. Across all sets and reps and across all training protocols, we saw no significant increase in cortisol. The fact that this is just one-off bouts of testing probably has something to do with that. And actually, when we look at the doing 4 reps at our 8 rep max, we actually saw a slight lowering of cortisol.
So one of the things we did mention in the methods and procedures, but their average 1RM in the squat, Smith machine squat now was approximately, the median I think was about 100 kilos plus or minus like 10 kilos, and then the median bench was something like 88 kilos plus or minus 19 kilos. So in their defense, they're pretty weak, but obviously it's very hard to find well-trained people who can do a 20-week study. Now, I'm not saying that this would change, but it'd be interesting to see if we took people who are not a lot more, but more well-trained. So we're talking like 3 or 4 years of actual strength training, like legitimate strength training, even not to glorify the barbell, back squat or bench press, but like, would that have been different if someone had done like a high bar back squat or a low bar back squat within just a barbell, and same with the bench with significant loads? So realistically, for most people, 100 kilos is not a massive load. Now, I know if they had some strength training experience, it might be adapted to some kind of resistance training, but you'd wonder, eventually with an absolute load, incur a different kind of stress in the body, maybe increase the cortisol. It would be interesting to see cortisol. Jesus.
I think what we're probably seeing here is that when the volume is low, so that you're getting no stress stimulus from the volume, and then the intensity is low, so you're doing 4 reps at your 8 rep max, like the reduction in cortisol levels or the reduction in stress hormone levels following exercise has been very well documented in the past, and it's probably what we're seeing here. You have this, it's in between, so it's there's not enough volume for it to be stressful, and there's not enough intensity for it to be stressful, so it's more than likely just exercise effects on stress hormone.
Yeah, and like again, it's just 3 sets, so every 2 weeks.
Yeah. Then the next hormone that they looked at and the effect it had was growth hormone and the release of growth hormone. So what we see with the release of growth hormone is it's more towards the higher end. So we get a significant increase in growth hormone release directly following 10 reps at the 10 rep max. And what they've kind of speculated towards in the paper is that exercise that's inducing kind of anaerobic glycolysis may be a cue, or maybe cueing for the release of growth hormone. And there's some other references to papers that are kind of pointing in this direction. Probably like this becomes important when we look at hypertrophy programs, like programs specifically looking at building muscle. It shows that we need volume as like the main thing, so like higher reps, and we also need a bit of intensity there to really trigger that kind of anaerobic glycolysis. So really using up the glycogen storage we have in the muscle and going towards failure.
I think you may hear the word like growth hormone increase, and you're like, that's the sets and reps, I'm just going to do 10s all the time. What?
Yeah.
3 by 10 all the time at their 10 RM, was it?
Yeah.
So doing that kind of level of volume, you may think, I'm just going to do that all the time and I'm going to be super jacked, I'm going to be fucking really lean. Like growth hormone is increased with like lower body fat levels, etc., etc. Is it significant in terms of, if you do this frequently, will you suddenly see a massive increase in body like lean mass and lower body fat? And like obviously we know the answer is very, very unlikely, but it is certainly interesting that it did increase that particular rep range, as opposed to the other ones did increase. So it's obviously, maybe there might be something with a 10 RM we know can be reasonably heavy, but it's obviously still a lot of volume in one particular session with lower rest sets. So certainly something to that, I think. Yeah,
definitely. Like the next hormone I think we should talk about is prolactin. So prolactin is a hormone that deals predominantly with maintaining homeostasis with other hormone groups. So like it's released when we might have a need for increased, or we might have a need for cueing of hormone production. We see significant increase in prolactin following almost all of the sets and reps protocols across all intensities. But we see more like larger values when we have higher volume. So the 12s, the 10s, the 8s all see larger increases in the release of prolactin, like directly following the exercise protocol. So what they're talking about in the paper is prolactin is linked with the level of blood lactate. So like the level of lactate within the muscle group. So it's more than likely that at the lower reps and lower, like not going to failure, we're not producing enough lactate within the muscle, and we're not getting the release of prolactin like we would in the higher reps and sets.
I suppose one thing about like lactic or lactate acid, I suppose, is that for a while, or some people speculate that does lactic acid induce hypertrophy, but it's like if you look at the mechanism of action, which we won't get into this, like it almost certainly doesn't. Like for one of them, lactate is transported throughout the body as soon as it's created to different muscles, so it's very unlikely. It's almost certainly not related to hypertrophy. It may actually be not hypertrophy, like not detrophying, but it may inhibit hypertrophy a little bit. So I don't think there's too much to read into this in regards to that. What do we next?
And like when you see with prolactin that there's significant increases across all reps and sets, when we don't have the significant increase in growth hormone, testosterone, cortisol, or IGF-1, like it's very unlikely that we'd get this increase in one of the hormonal values across all of the exercise interventions and not get it in any of the important ones. Okay, so the next one we'll talk about is IGF-1. And most people involved in strength training, most people involved in kind of power sports will constantly hear about IGF-1, the release of IGF-1, how to prolong the release of IGF-1. It's insulin-like growth factor 1. It's often linked, or it's spoken about with growth hormone. It triggers growth adaptation in muscle fibers. So IGF-1 was seen to have some significant increases following the exercise interventions, mirroring the significant increases we saw with growth hormone. It's the higher volume stuff going to failure again is what we're seeing as triggering the largest response in IGF-1.
So that might be a better indicator of how useful this might be for muscle hypertrophy compared to the growth hormone one. Like the IGF-1, as it's increased more at the higher range or more volume sets. So it might be a good indicator that these were better for hypertrophy. But again, obviously that's not a conclusive. More IGF-1 doesn't always mean, it may not always mean more hypertrophy.
Yeah, so then we have two left. The second last one we'll talk about is creatine kinase, right? And we saw increases in creatine kinase across the broad spectrum. So we saw that a lot of different intensities, a lot of different volume ranges. Creatine kinase is more than likely just a trigger of like creatine phosphate being used. So in terms of growth, in terms of triggering of hypertrophy, it's probably not that important, and it's probably not one of the main ones we'd pay attention to here. What creatine kinase would lead to is kind of fatigue markers, so perceived fatigue, perceived exertion.
Yeah, so like creatine kinase would usually be associated with like muscle damage, and like when was the most muscle damage done or whatever, like so different levels of that. Again, I suppose it's like any one biochemical kind of like indicator is you never want to make huge inferences from it. So like the more sets and reps they did, or well the more reps it is, the more volume they did, total reps, the more creatine kinase we saw. So, and obviously there was more of that at the higher ends. So really, what does that mean for someone like, if you were a strength training athlete or you're a field athlete on season, for example, this is a good indicator that like maybe you don't want to be doing a lot of 12s, 10s or 8s in your on season training if you're trying to complete your sports. Like you don't want to be breaking down muscle tissue. Ultimately, you don't even want to be trying to gain muscle tissue in this time period. So really what you're doing is kind of maintaining as much muscle mass as possible, because inevitably you're going to be losing it. Like if you're a rugby player or a track and field athlete, the likelihood is the stresses of your season for a whole host of reasons are causing a lot of damage. So you don't want to be doing any activities that unnecessarily increase creatine kinase or something like that, or cortisol, and then negatively affecting your like sporting performance. So your sporting performance almost certainly will incur some kind of like creatine kinase, like if you're doing a lot of running or something like that, or it will happen. So you don't want to be doing anything that will make any additional load, like you don't want to increase this amount of creatine kinase in your blood. So again, like we said, it's a good indicator of muscle damage, but we don't know, does it mean you're going to get more muscle hypertrophy?
Yeah, and that's the thing, like oftentimes when we're measuring creatine kinase, you're doing like a simple blood test, and they use it on like a daily basis to measure fatigue. So if you've got a really short time period to bring somebody back in shape, you'd use that creatine measure to see if they're overtraining, or as kind of a marker of trying to predict overtraining prior to somebody getting into those realms. Okay, one of the more interesting ones, or one of the more interesting findings when we look at biochemical outcomes of the exercise bouts, is that we have this appearance of like junk volume, right? So it's an exercise where we get an increase in creatine kinase, so there's damage being done of some sort, but we don't get a corresponding increase in IGF-1, growth hormone, testosterone, any of the kind of important hormones afterwards. So there's damage being done, but biochemically we're not getting those adaptation hormone releases afterwards. These kind of sets and reps are like doing 4 reps at your 8 rep max, doing 5 reps at your 10 rep max, or doing like 3 reps at your 5 rep max. So it's, the volume is so low that you don't get that kind of volume adaptation, and then obviously the intensity is so low that you don't get any kind of increase from the stress of the exercise.
I think this is probably the most important like aspect of this study for you to take away. Like, this is the most significant thing that you should like kind of learn from this, if nothing else, that like there is kind of dead zones in volume and intensity where it's not heavy enough to make any significant increases in your ability to train strength training, and there's not enough volume that you're increasing any kind of significant hypertrophy if you take like the biochemical indicators as those indicators of good hypertrophy. So like, this is, I think we talked about this in our squat every day, where you're like, you're doing enough squats that you're making yourself very fatigued, but you're not doing enough squats or at enough intensity whereby you're increasing your 1RM. So like, this is good to see it in kind of like a rigorous kind of scientific setting, where like it's important to note like that if you are training, and I think this is the biggest practical takeaway from this, that if you're training, like you should know why you're doing what you're doing, and you should have good reasons for you're doing it, and there should be like real, like, maybe you can't prove it scientifically, and like maybe it just works from experience, but you should have like really like a rigorous reason why you're doing this. For most cases. Now a lot of times it's hard to do this, but you should have a solid reason of why what you're doing has like either outcomes in your sporting performance, like your coordination, your strength training, or muscle hypertrophy, whatever your athletic or gym endeavor is. Like, don't just come in and do like shitty training. Don't just do a little bit of volume, a little intensity. Like, even as a deload, this would be a terrible idea, because you are creating kinase damage, but you're not like causing any positive adaptation. Like, so you're just causing a lot of fatigue for no benefits.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so moving on from the kind of boring biochemistry and moving on to our kind of physics and our biomechanical outcomes, we see a lot of the same kind of results being mirrored, right? So if we look at decrease in bar speed, what tends to happen on the bench press is we get a 50 to 60% reduction in bar speed when we're doing like 12s, 10s and 8s at our 12, 10s and 8 RM, which is very similar to kind of the hormone release we're seeing. And then on squat, we see 40 to 50% reductions in our 12, 10s and 8s at our 12, 10 and 8 RM respectively.
So this is at that, so remember we mentioned at the pre-assessment, they got a load that they can move at 1 meter per second, and it reduced, obviously, significantly the velocity of that barbell in the in the squat or the bench press reduced significantly after high volume intense training with like minimal rest between them.
Yeah, I think an important thing here is, right, the other thing that happens is this fatigue is prolonged. So like, there's still fatigue there after 6 hours. After 24 hours across most of the exercise sets and reps, the fatigue values are like, these reductions are almost completely gone. An interesting thing for weightlifters, an interesting thing for athletes who do 2-a-days, is across a lot of the sets and reps, after 6 hours, most of your speed is back. You're back to 95% of your speed, which is significant, you know, and it's something that if you're designing 2-a-day protocols, studies like this are very, very handy for you to see the kind of loading and the intensity levels that people can recover from when they're training within like 12 hours of each session. I think another kind of important aspect of this study is, so we see the really big decreases, so our 50-60% decreases in bar speed when we're at these like maximal going to failure, so like 10 sets of 10 at our 10 RM, right? But what we see is a marked reduction from other studies. So studies they've referenced have shown like 20 to 25% decreases when they go to 50% of max repetitions, right? So this is our doing 4 reps at our 8 RM. So it's you're getting really lower fatigue values and less time in this kind of fatigue state when you do less volume at the same intensity.
So there's kind of like two kind of, I think from the whole study, like there's probably two big things to take away from this. They kind of covered a lot, like in terms of like if you're a hypertrophy focused trainee and if you're kind of an athlete, like so Fitz kind of covered the athletic endeavor there, where you're like, you need to be watching. Well, you not need to be watching, but it's good to be able to watch your speed of movement, like in on-season or whatever. And then in your kind of like hypertrophy training, it seems very, very likely, and this is supported by a good amount of other studies kind of coming out in the last few years, that like going to near failure is very important, and higher volume is important for muscle training, like, or for muscle hypertrophy. So like, again, I think that kind of aspect of the dead zone is very, very important to take away from this too. Like you've hit some creatine kinase muscle damage, but you haven't really, have you hit that threshold where you've done enough damage to cause a positive adaptation?
Yeah, and like an important side note to Gerf's first point, right? So he's talking about high volume being like high volume and slowing yourself down through volume and intensity. So like fatiguing yourself, going maximally is really important for muscle growth. But then we have the other papers referenced in this where slowing yourself down, so like going to failure to the point whereby the speed you can move the bar at is slower, is very, very bad for the expression of type 2X fibers. So like fast twitch muscle fibers do not react well to this kind of maximal training style. So if you're doing bodybuilding style stuff where you're going to failure with high volume, it doesn't matter how much of it you'll do, you won't get those type 2 fiber adaptations. So you will become slower. And this probably is where a lot of the kind of preconceived notions of people being muscle bound and athletes coming back after an off season and being slow and less powerful because they've gained muscle. Like it's not the muscle binding them and being unable to move as quickly. It's more than likely that they've shifted their fiber type expression. So their fast twitch fibers will have shrunk slightly in their cross-sectional area and their slow twitch fibers would have expanded. So I think that is like, to add on to Gerf's first point there, is like you need to be training at significant volume to bring about muscular changes. But if you're an athlete who focuses on speed and power, bringing about muscular changes may not be the most important thing right now.
And like what you can kind of infer from that with associated other like kind of studies and like people's understanding the mechanism of action of like fast twitch fibers, like, you know, and it's kind of adds to that weight that they're very susceptible to fatigue, and it takes, in terms of like training sessions, like a significant amount of time to recover. Like, so fast twitch fibers by their nature are fast, like they're not the ones you're using in marathon. Like you could kind of infer this from yourself if you thought about it like for a few seconds. Like the slow twitch fibers are the ones you lose for a very long time. So it makes sense that Usain Bolt can't repeat his world records sprints multiple times over the course of a day, multiple times in a row. Like this just kind of solidifies that like they're susceptible to fatigue, and they fatigue quite soon and then they take a little bit of time to recover. I would imagine almost certainly that these recovery times, like, are what we could infer from these, would, if they repeated these 2-3 times a week, that they would start seeing like more creatine kinase or whatever damage, and you would see a slower recovery time and probably slower barbell speed in terms of like the 1 meter per second. You would see that even, I'd say, decreasing by more, so like more than 50 or 60%.
Yeah.
Like you'd probably see somewhere maybe 70% or beyond if they kept fatiguing those muscle fibers with the higher reps.
Yeah.
There's a lot to take away from this. It's kind of a...
Definitely. Like it's a good study. There's obviously some cons to it. So like single exercise and like the amount of times people actually do the interventions.
It's not really an intervention, I suppose. Like,
or sorry, not.
It's more of
yeah. So it is like, it's a good study. I think there's a lot of value to be gleaned from it, I think definitely if you're somebody who has a method of measuring velocity, so if you've like a bar tracker, if you've a dynamometer, if you've anything like that, or access to anything like that, I think this stuff becomes super applicable. Also, I think if you're somebody who writes their own training programs or writes training programs for other people, it can really allow you to start looking for some of those kind of junk sets and reps, and start looking for like, okay, this is the time I'm going to focus on muscular hypertrophy. This is the time we're going to focus on speed and power.
Yeah, like the important thing, I suppose, with this study was that it's not like an intervention. Like it wasn't, if we do this, we're going to see this. They just picked their impact on the like their subject, and then they wanted to see what impact that this had on their subject via different kind of like measurements. Like they weren't like our previous one. They weren't talking about an interventional study where they did this for this and then they expected to see this in the outcome or measured what it is. They just did in random order what was the biochemical and like mechanical fatigue on the system. I would really I suppose one of the cons for people watching this is that, like, to be honest, their subjects were quite weak, and as we know about newbie gains, like we know that initial strength trainers have totally different outcomes in terms of like adaptions or their gains with a Z over the course of the training. So it would be very nice to see people, maybe like there's a lot of like well-trained powerlifters out there, like it'd be really nice to see something like that. And I know it's hard to get access to, and I know it's hard for them. These were sports science students, as they said in the paper, and very likely the same people who just needed someone for their own study. They got to do this, but it would be interesting to see couple of powerlifters, even 10 of them, so they 10 in this, so if you 10 well-trained natty IPF vegan IPF powerlifters who are, you know, somewhere in the region of like 200 kilo back squats.
I think if you have like, if you can get 1.5 times body weight bench presses, double body weight squats, and 2.5 times deadlifts, and repeat this, that'd be very interesting. Like I've no idea what the difference in findings would be, but there might be nothing, and that would be just as interesting. It would be like, oh, so it is consistent regardless of your training levels. But in terms of like the testing, like the ecological validity of this it is fairly strong, right? So they've got people who aren't super experienced. They've put them in a Smith machine, which everybody is suddenly experienced in because they're really easy to use. Like we were talking smack before this started about the warm-up protocols. Most warm-up protocols in 90% of resistance training testing are bad, but like it's the consistency. The consistency is the important thing. I think it doesn't really matter, like, because they're so light. They're so light. What are they going to do? Warm-ups with 35 kilos, 45 kilos, 50? Like realistically, like they could probably go on the Smith machine straight to their working sets. After a reasonable warm-up. So like they just had to do a consistent warm-up. Like we know from, it's consistently bad across studies. Like it's just not bad for the study. It's just a bad warm-up. Like like they did like sprints, running, jogging, sprinting, jumping, and air squats, then into 100%. Well, so one of the other things, I think it's not really a con, but it's just an issue I have, and this is what they kind of use the velocity-based monitoring of their reps, was that they say things like the subjects did their 12 RM or their 10 RM or their 4 RM, and anyone watching this knows there's no way you can do 3 sets with your 12 RM and not after 5 minutes rest between them. Like even with your 4 RM, you might be able to do 1 set. Obviously you can do 1 set with your 4 RM, and then you might after a few minutes be able to do like 2 more reps again, or maybe another set of 2 after that. But there's no way you're going to be doing 3 sets of 4 with that. But again, this is the nature of lower trained subjects, or not at all trained really. So main takeaways from this: specificity. So specificity obviously is important. We need to be looking at our sets, reps, and loading for whatever adaptation we want to seek. And then I think specifically, if we're somebody who can monitor bar speed and we're looking for increases in strength, in speed and power outputs, we should be looking for 20% reductions in speed over the course of our sets, and not much more than that. Like in training, goals can have vastly different outcomes, and they do not overlap a lot of the time in terms of like muscle hypertrophy and like being really fast at the same time. So maybe you can do them different times throughout the year. So a multi-year plan is important, but you can't try be really fast as possible and get yacked. Like I would imagine even no amount of drugs will eventually lead to this kind of
hyper. You can't be the fastest you can possibly be and the most yacked you can be.
No.
Otherwise, Ronnie Coleman would be very fast. Imagine how scary that would be. Imagine how scary that
If
would
Ronnie Coleman was all type 2X.
be. Yeah, he probably is though. 800 pounds for 3 to 4.
Yeah.
Okay, lads. Thanks. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like if you like this. We do appreciate a comment. Just let us know, was there any parts of this that you did like? So people mentioned recently that they like some of the results and what we kind of inferred from them. So let us know what you like about this. Let us know if you like the new studio lights. People mentioned that they wanted
you to talk into your microphone.
They wanted to talk about potentially some like vertical jumps and stuff like that.
Okay.
So we'll try look. So we're trying to do these recent studies, so kind of up to date ones.
Yeah, we're gonna like next week will definitely be a randomized control trial, like a gold standard study is what
RCT
we're
like
RCT.
Yeah.
We'll if it's a kind of caffeine or creatine one, we'll do a placebo control trial.
Yeah.
So we'll do like really high quality studies. Just tell us what you want in the comments below.
We'll do the caffeine.
Thanks,
and
guys. The creatine.
Thanks, guys.